Ladies and gentlemen, it's your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs. Now, what we can accomplish nowadays with computers when it comes to 3D modeling and animations and design work is pretty amazing, but it hasn't always been that way. Of course, relatively recently, things were very, very different. Huge drawing offices were full of designers using pens and ink and markers to bring their ideas to life and basically transition them from paper eventually to real steel things, amazing structures like bridges and especially ships. On this channel, we've talked a lot about the way ships are designed. We haven't talked a lot about the actual plans themselves. They come in all different shapes and sizes, and I thought today we could do something kind of fun. I thought we'd look at a set of plans that are some of my absolute favorites. They're absolutely spectacular. Beautiful color illustrations of a very famous ship called the Mauretania. So today, let's wind back the clock to the early 1900s when designers were sitting down with their drawing squares and their pens trying to bring this ship to life in a new segment I like to call Grand Plans. Now, the first set of plans we're going to look at are for the Mauretania. Now, the Mauretania, as I mentioned, is extremely famous. First of all, she was the sister ship, kind of, I'll explain that in a minute, sister ship and running mate to Lusitania, arguably the more famous ship, mainly because of the tragedy. Mauretania was a real thoroughbred greyhound of a thing. It was designed mainly for speed, and that's definitely going to come through as we look at these plans. Now, these plans are held by the Royal Museum in Greenwich, in England, and some friends and I went in and bought a couple of sets of these so we can zoom right in and get some really nice detail. And the first thing you'll notice about these plans is they're in color. So this is a pretty remarkable, huge side profile plan. It's called the rigging plan, and it's essentially completed by the designers to show Cunard Line's executives what Mauretania could look like when she's finished. And what's really cool about this plan is they've marked out a lot of things that other designers typically don't mark out in their plans. So they've got the ship's nameplate colored in, they've used the correct colors for the hull and things like that. So they've actually gone to a lot of effort coloring this plan, but it also serves a purpose, which is to show off what all the rigging does. So let's fly around it and have a look. So here you can see all of the various kinds of rigging and things. Again, so this is essentially a ink and watercolor plan. So they've used a mixture of paints to try and get these colors. You can see already, just having a look at some of the detail here, they've even gone so far as to put at the top of the mast here, just above the American flag, you can see what looks like a little wind vane. And there's actually a lightning rod attached to that, so that the lightning could be directed away from the wireless antenna, which is below the flag, and actually strike that point, which isn't a big deal at all, because the top part of the mast, from probably around about here up where these lights are, is made out of wood, because it's in contact with the wireless antenna, and you don't want metal touching electrical wires like that. That's bad news. What's really funny about this plan, though, is they've even gone to the effort of painting in the sky and the background, which is really nice. So it's showing off all the different kinds of rigging which can be used. So you can see that Mauretania has been equipped with these big cargo derricks, and you can see they've marked in on the plans the blocks, their positions where they could be like kind of posed to pick cargo up and load them inside the ship. I cannot get over how beautiful these plans are, how stunningly well drawn they are, and you have to remember that this was all done by hand, and they're well over 110 years old. Almost 120 years old. And they've held up really, really well. They're beautiful plans. One thing that you get a sense of straight away is actually when we zoom out and get like a full length view of the ship, you really get a sense of how simple it is. It really is just like hull, and then a very, very little bit of the superstructure on top, the white part of the structure there. The superstructure is, of course, sitting on top of the hull. It's essentially full of a lot of the public rooms and things like that. And one of the plans we look at after this is a cross-section where you can look right down the middle of the ship and see all the public rooms, which is very, very cool. One thing that made Mauretania stand out over her sister was the amount of these big, tall cowl vents, is what they're called, and they essentially look like big elephant ears. They're like the classic vent that everyone thinks of when they think of old steamships, and Mauretania had a whole bunch of them. And the reason they're different to those on Lusitania is because Mauretania and Lusitania are actually built to the same basic layout, but by two different shipyards and companies. And it was a bit of a move by Cunard Line to ensure that the two sister ships would be of their optimum quality. And by getting two different yards to build them, you had a little bit of, shall we say, friendly rivalry going on. So they're both going to be going out of their way to try and make the best ship. So Lusitania's vents look completely different to this. They were just like little drum vents that kind of look like bins with lids on them. The designers here, the planners, have made it very helpful for us to see a lot of the details that you might otherwise miss. For example, the amount of deck lights. You can see these little yellow circles along the superstructure here. So these are deck lamps, and they're all electric because Mauretania was powered by electricity. She had some very complicated plant down there to enable her to actually function as a modern ship with a full electrical system. And for a long time, it was really hard to actually get adequate lighting for passengers if they wanted to walk around at nighttime, because the ocean is a very dark place. And if you can't see where you're going, a ship is really not a fun place to be, because you can fall down ladders, or you can trip over, bollards, or you can trip over bits of equipment that are left lying around. So we take it for granted now. But if you ever go on a cruise ship, or you go on the Queen Mary 2, for example, today, you'll see it's just covered in lights outside. Interestingly, though, they did turn these off at a certain point during the night, when they essentially figured that everyone was in bed, usually around 10, 11 p.m. or midnight. The deck lights would be extinguished, but you can actually see how many there are. There's a lot. What else is really cool about these plans here is that we get a sense of the original lifeboat layout for the Mauretania, is that she had a set of 4 boats back here towards the stern of the ship, and a big blank space in the middle, and then towards the bow of the ship we had another 4 boats. And this is essentially identical to Titanic's main lifeboat layout. And Titanic gets all the flack for going to sea without enough boats for everyone on board, but of course every other ship essentially did that at the same time. And as we can see from this, Mauretania was one of them. And later on in her career, after the Titanic sank, they filled that nice little blank space there with more lifeboats, for good reason. It's so eye-achingly beautiful. Again, really, really unusual to see plans like this in colour. The artist has used watercolours to really beautiful effect, but then I think they might have used oils on the funnel to get that really bright, deep red for the Cunard funnels. I think Mauretania is one of the most beautiful ships ever built. You really get a sense of the sleekness. You can see that she's a Greyhound designed for speed. One of the things that is quite funny, though, is to contrast how modern Mauretania was, like those electrical systems and things I was telling you about, with just these big bits of equipment just lying around. So this is a water tank that's just sitting behind the 4th funnel. And the Lusitania and the Mauretania were covered in a lot of these pieces of equipment that just litter the top deck. Because in theory, they would be out of sight of passengers, because passengers were not allowed up there. Passengers were allowed here on the boat deck. You couldn't really go up to the top deck because that was not allowed. And there are these ladders here. You can see one here leading down, but that was for crew only. And for good reason. One of those reasons being these things. Thermotanks. Thermotanks, we've talked a little bit about these on the channel before, but they're essentially a early form of air conditioning that could essentially create hot air by heating it with steam in pipes. They probably would have been a little hot to the touch, especially the tank where the steam was kept. So you don't want your passengers up there kind of walking around and touching things. That's bad news. Another really unique design feature of the Lusitania and the Mauretania was the split between this part of the superstructure, which was for first class, and this part of the superstructure, which was for second class. And as if to make the delineation any clearer, there's literally a break between the second class's structural island here at the stern of the ship and the little area forward of that, which is for first class. And there's these little bridges here that just run across the gap. And so passengers or crew more likely could get from one part of the ship to the other. But they would have had gates here to separate first and second class. Very class-based society, of course. An interesting little detail, which I think is really cool, is that the designers have included camber as a detail. So I'll explain myself. You see how the railings look like they kind of flick up at the ends? They don't. They just actually, when they go across the ship's width, they're following the ship's camber. And the camber is essentially the upper decks sag down at either side, and it's essentially to provide runoff for water if it gathers on the deck, but also back then provided some more structural rigidity. It made it a little stronger. And you can see here that very cleverly the designers have got it. If you did look at something from the side like this, if the ship in cross-section was curved like that, it would look like the railings kind of flick up. And you can see it everywhere all over the drawing, and it's really nicely done. You can see it especially here at the docking bridge. This is right at the stern of the ship. And you can see that the sides of the docking bridge look like they're kind of like sagging down towards the ocean. That's a really nice little detail. Very, very impressive work. They've also included a lot of details on the hull, like the plating. You can see the strakes following the lines of the hull. And it's pretty amazing, again, when you think that this was just done by hand, by people in a big office, just working with inks and markers and all kinds of things. What a beautiful plan. How cool. Good job. But now we're going to do something even more fun, because the designers of the Mauretania, well, they didn't just draw the outside of the ship, they also drew the inside. And the inside is where things get even more interesting. This is a sectional elevation. It's longitudinal. Essentially, what they've done is they've taken the Mauretania and cut it in half, right down the middle. And now we can go inside and have a look, like we've got X-ray vision, like we're Superman or something. This is amazing. So again, just to remind you, all done by hand. Immediately obvious is the fact that so much of this ship's internal space is chewed up by machinery. So Mauretania's whole reason for being was speed. She was meant to be the fastest ship at sea. And fair play to them, she was. She was the fastest ship, and she held that record for a very, very long time. But it came at a little expense for the designers, because getting that much horsepower out of steam turbine engines back then required a monumental amount of coal. Mauretania would be burning hundreds of tons of stuff every day. And so you had to have the boilers, you had to have the steam turbines. Let's follow the steam on its journey and see just how much space of the Mauretania is taken up by the engines. So here we've got the forward boiler rooms. Now you can see what's really cool is they've included the big main steam lines that run all the way down. Essentially, the boilers, as they're boiling that water off into steam, the water is being taken by these main lines aft towards the engines. Another interesting thing are the fan rooms here. These big Scirocco fans. They're a centrifugal fan, and they essentially draw air from the upper decks, and that's what those big vents are for. So if you actually look a little further up, you'll see there are some big stokehold vents right here. And so what they're doing is they're providing a channel for fresh air to be drawn in, and the fan all the way down at the bottom of the ship is drawing that air in and then depositing it into the boiler room, into the boilers to create a more efficient burn, and also provide some fresh air, because it's pretty nightmarish down there. The temperatures down in the boiler rooms back then used to run as hot as, you know, your 40s and 50s degrees Celsius, which is like 120 plus Fahrenheit. So kind of scary. To also help with keeping things cooler, you can see that there's essentially just a big vacant void right down the middle here. And that was trunking that essentially held the uptakes. So you can see the uptakes and the lower funnel, which is this big kind of like tree trunk looking thing with the branches, or really like the roots at the bottom. Now, the uptakes are taking the hot gases and the fumes from the furnaces in the boilers up to the funnel so they can be blown away behind the ship. But there's also just blank space around the uptakes. And the reason being is that at the top of those blank spaces were openings, gratings, and very simply, hot air rises. So the idea would be, hopefully, as you're bringing fresh air in with those fans at the fan rooms, it's displacing hot air, which itself is just floating up and out of the ship. I don't know that it was that successful as a system, because it was still pretty nightmarish in the boiler rooms of ships like this. But a little later in her career, Mauretania was converted to oil burning, so it meant that all of that coal and all that dust, it was done away with, and life was a lot better for the few stokers and firemen who stayed behind working on the ship. So steam is being created, and it is being fed into the main steam lines. If we follow it back, you can see that unlike Titanic and Olympic, every funnel, all 4 funnels, are connected directly to a set of boilers. So we get to this point in the ship. We're now at the 4th funnel, and this is where things very interestingly start to happen. So the main steam lines feed directly into the ship's turbines. Now, Mauretania had 4 propellers. Each one had its own dedicated turbine for running ahead. So the steam turbines are essentially, we've talked again a lot about turbines on this channel, but imagine a big rotor drum with hundreds of little fan blades sticking out of it inside of a casing. And if you blast that steam that's super hot, it's under a lot of pressure through that casing, it's going to turn the rotor with the blades attached to it. Now that's obviously attached directly to the ship's shaft and then the propellers at the very end. But they can only run in one direction. So the blade angles on the rotors back then couldn't be changed. So there had to be a separate set of turbines for running the ship backwards. The astern turbines, which are obviously a lot smaller and not as powerful, but essentially meant that Mauretania could run forwards at immense speed and then backwards at slower speed, but at least she could still run backwards. So you can just make out the outline of some of the turbines down here, but taking up even more space are the condensers. Right here. The condenser does the job of essentially turning the steam back into water and sending it back through the system. The condenser is very important because they're handling a huge amount of steam and water and keeping the system going in this sort of closed loop. And then again, we talked about how hot air rises out of the ship. You can see that Mauretania had a pretty extensive kind of like shaft leading out of the engine room here with a skylight at the top, essentially again providing natural light down into the bottom of the engine room, and then hot air would float out and hopefully provide a little bit of relief for the poor engineering crew. Unlike the older style of engine, triple expansion steam engine, the turbines are extremely loud and they kind of make this shrieking, grinding noise, which is horrifying to listen to. So I certainly do not envy the men who are working in the bottom of the ship. This plan gives us a really good picture of how the passenger accommodations and the public rooms and things here. So we can see here the second class main stairwell right here, because this is the big second class tower of the ship that I was telling you about. They had to work everything around the engines. So the passengers, even though they're paying for this ship and they're essentially the main reason for being, they're kind of like playing second fiddle to these enormous pieces of machinery. Because again, now that we've come to the end of our steam journey, if we zoom right out, you can see just how much of the ship is taken up by the engines. The other thing that designers had to deal with back then were the uptakes themselves, because they go right through the middle of the ship. And you would probably want to have these beautiful, long, flowing public rooms, and it was a huge pain, because all the way through, you had the funnels evenly spaced apart, and the uptakes were running right through the middle of your nice, fancy lounge. And so, for a long time, designers just basically had to squeeze lounges and things in between the funnel uptakes. So you can see here, for example, between funnels 3 and 4, we've got the main first-class dining saloon down here in the bottom of the ship, where you've got this big, beautiful dome that's inset over this 2-story tall dining saloon, which is very, very cool. And then above it, one of the first-class lounges, I think, which is, again, fed with natural light from a dome above it, and just nestled in between the funnels, because the uptakes were at either end. Until designers figured out with later ships like the Vaunted in 1914 that you could actually have the funnel uptakes of the ship running out from the boilers to the sides of the ship and then meeting at the top, kind of like a cathedral. It created this huge empty space in the middle. And then you could have those long interrupted rooms. But back then, they really weren't doing it. So designers kind of had to, work around the constraints. And it was a never-ending battle for designers to make ships feel comfortable and like a hotel, but then also have to deal with the fact that you've got 15,000 tons of steam machinery all over the place. Not that much, but you know what I mean. If we go back to the stern of the ship for a minute, you can see the shaft as it's leaving the turbine here. The propeller shaft runs all the way through and out. You can see how quite long it is. And again, very difficult to ensure that these things didn't break as the ship was bending and flexing. And essentially, the shaft was made up of multiple individual components of, steel, basically steel cylinder. And they were joined together in such a way that they could actually bend and flex with the ship as they went. They just had to be reinforced with brackets as they went all the way through and out of the ship. And when we get to the stern of the ship here, you can see just how much of it is actually being used for tanks. So we've got the after peak tank here. And this is a really big tank. It's about 2 stories tall. And again, it's just an empty space that's full of water. And it does 2 things. So first of all, it means you can take on ballast and essentially adjust if your ship is loaded, for example, with too much coal towards the stern of the ship, and it's therefore sitting lower in the water at the stern. You could let some water out of this. There'd be a couple of 100 tons of water in there. Let it out with valves, and the stern would become more buoyant, and it would lift. And of course, at the other end of the ship, we have a nice corresponding forward peak tank right here. This one's bigger. So that's 202 tons of probably seawater that would be held at the peak tank at the bow here. And that way you can adjust what is called the trim of your ship, which is if it's sitting too far forward, you let water out of the fore peak tank, or you just put more water in the aft tank. We'll come back to the bow in a minute. One of the other things that's really interesting about the stern here is the fact that Mauretania had a little nasty secret. And even though, yes, she was a passenger ship first and foremost, she was also secretly designed to go to war, because British imperialism in the early 1900s was incorrigible. And there's a couple of dead giveaways that show that Mauretania had a secret ulterior motive behind her design. And one of those was actually the placement of her emergency steering wheel, or helm. So we can actually see, of course, the ship would have the main steering wheel all the way forward at the bridge. Now, this was connected to the after steering engines, which were down here. The steering gear is right above the ship's rudder. So here's the rudder. That's how the ship's steering its way through the water. The steering gear here is essentially a big steam engine that is geared directly to the rudder, and it's basically reacting to inputs from a system, a hydraulic system, actuated all the way forward here in the bridge, in the wheelhouse, by a thing called the telemotor. So here's the wheelhouse, and you can see it's enclosed, it's protected so that that wheel, the main helm, is not going to be broken or damaged by big waves. And the telemotor that the wheel is sitting on essentially translates the inputs of the helmsman steering the wheel into hydraulic lines that can then mechanically feed back all the way back here, 600 or 700 feet away, at the stern of the ship, directly into the steering gear, which turns the steam engine, which turns the ship's rudder. Now, there's an obvious problem with this, which is if there's something wrong with your hydraulics, or there's a break in the line, or the telemotor's not working, how do you steer the ship? Well, fortunately, there was also made allowance for an emergency steering room right here. And this was actually inside the docking bridge. So just below the top of the docking bridge, inside this little compartment, there was an emergency steering room. And essentially the way this worked is this was also keyed directly into the steering engines. How far below is that? Though 4 or 5 stories below, right here. And basically, if there was a problem, the crew, the captain and the senior officers could stay at the bridge and send... with a telegraph, a steering telegraph, they could send orders directly back to the emergency steering position here. So the guys in here wouldn't even really necessarily need to see where they were going, because they're just responding to orders from the bridge further up. But the Mauretania also had a secret third steering position. And this is the real dead giveaway that she was a warship. Secretly a warship. Because here is the auxiliary steering gear room. And this is obviously a backup in case the main steering gear goes, but it was possible to steer the ship from down here as well. Now, why would you need a third steering position all the way down here? Well, it's below the waterline. You can see that the waterline is here, and the emergency and auxiliary steering machine rooms are down here. And that was basically to protect them from gunfire. It was presumed that Mauretania could be converted into a cruiser, and she could hunt down a German shipping and engage them with guns. In practice, it turned out not to work so well, and so Mauretania was converted into a troop ship and a hospital ship. But by putting things like your emergency steering room down here below the waterline, it meant that you would hopefully be protected from large or, ship caliber gun hits. In practice, again, it doesn't work because a shell falling short of its target isn't necessarily badly slowed by the water. It actually just activates the fuse earlier, meaning that it could blow a hole in the side of the ship before it reaches it. So for a smaller caliber gun, like a 4 or 5 inch gun, maybe it would protect the Mauretania. But anything bigger than that is cutting straight through it. Like, Mauretania is not designed with armor. If a battleship or something, if a heavy cruiser with, 8-inch guns engaged the Mauretania, she'd be cut apart like Swiss cheese. And it did happen to other ships early in the war. But the designers back then, I think, were a little bit optimistic with what they thought these ships could do during wartime. Another example of Mauretania's modernity is quite cool. You can see here there is actually an electric lift. So Mauretania was fitted with lifts both for passengers and cargo. So this one's got a Bostwick gate, you can see here, and it could essentially run all the way down here into the baggage room. This is baggage, so this is storage specifically for passenger bags. And the reason ships had dedicated baggage rooms is because Mauretania is getting you to New York from Liverpool, for example, right? So you have, say you're going away for 6 months. You've got a week-long voyage on the Mauretania that you have to pack for and get dressed every night and wear your clothes, of course. And then when you get to New York, you have all the things that you want to take with you to live in your house. Now, the things you want to take with you to live in your house, you don't need on the Mauretania. So what passengers did back then was they would have 1 or 2 bags, or if you were some of the first class passengers, you might have 10 trunks, for example, of clothes that you wanted to wear on board the ship. But then you might have as many bags that you didn't want to have with you in your stateroom. And so on boarding day, you would put stickers on the things you wanted that literally said, "Wanted," and those would be taken by stewards to your cabin. If you had bags you didn't need, you would put a sticker on that said, "Not wanted," and they would end up down here, in the baggage room, and then you could claim them at the end of your voyage. A very clever little system. Going back to the plans for a minute here again, it's just like how beautiful the detail is. You can zoom right in and really get a sense of the craftsmanship that went into the drawings alone. The drawings are just as impressive as the finished ships. It's absolutely superb. Look at the paneling they've drawn in here. Gorgeous. So yeah, these are all second class spaces, and if we go a little further forward, you'll see this is where first class begins. So you can see there was this little palm court cafe at the stern of the ship that was pretty popular. It was a very open and airy space. You can see it had some nice trees and things in it. I don't know that it was as popular as much as the Cunard line wanted, but other similar spaces on other ships did really well. This was half open to the elements at one end, which maybe harmed its popularity a little bit because it's cold and kind of miserable on the North Atlantic a lot of the time. Interestingly though, the person doing this plan, or the team doing this plan, just didn't bother showing the cabins for first class. So here you can see it just says first class accommodation, and they haven't actually drawn the cabins in. I get the feeling maybe they ran out of time and couldn't really be bothered. But this doesn't look like the plan from somebody who can't really be bothered, you know what I mean? This is also eye-achingly beautiful. It's so cool. What a beautiful ship. This is another one of those lifts I was telling you about. You can actually just see here the machinery room. for the lift. You can see these wheels at the top here. I think this is the lift machinery housing here. And then here is the counterweight, potentially. And then here is the lift cab. And so you can actually just see the line runs all the way up here through these rollers down here. And it looks like if that is the counterweight, which I think it is, it's very cleverly concealed within the funnel casing, which is quite cool. You can see there's a lift cab down here as well. It was, again, like the scourge of passengers back then to have to climb all these sets of stairs, because for the longest time, ships had been big, you know, but not stories tall. You might have to climb maybe 3 flights of stairs to get from your cabin to dinner or vice versa. But at this point, you know, this ship is very tall, and people in their finery didn't really like, back then, walking up 9 flights, as we don't now. And so the idea of having electric lifts on ships back then, we take it for granted because we're used to it now. But that was like revolutionary back then. So cool. This is so early. I mean, Mauretania was actually planned and designed years before she was finished. So she was introduced around 1907, 1908. They'd been planning her since, you know, the earlier 1900s, you know, 1904. So it's pretty impressive technology when you think this is such a long time ago now. And it's just amazing to think it was all done by hand. Love it. Just moving forward here, we see more of the boiler rooms and things. So this is all first class accommodations and things. First class ends around about where the bridge is. So here's the bridge and the officers' quarters. We can see there's a compass binnacle up here above the bridge that could be used for ascertaining the ship's position and direction. But here is where we start to see the third class accommodations. So traditionally, third class were housed, you know, towards the stern of the ships or towards the bow, where things are a little less comfortable because you're at either extreme end of the ship. All the way up here, there's a lot of loud machinery. The ship would be pitching. It's less likely to bother you if it's in the middle of the ship. At the ends, you're going to have a bit of a rough ride. But that's what a third class ticket bought you, I guess. So you can see, for example, here we have it looks like the third class saloon or maybe general room, accessible by stairs. But Mauretania's third class was quite nicely decorated. Mauretania and Lusitania had fairly nice third class spaces. A lot of them were panelled in timber, which again is quite unusual for ships at that time, when steerage was basically just thrown into bare steel painted rooms for 6 or 7 days at a time and then deposited at Ellis Island. You can see here another really interesting part of the ship's design, which is just how much of the forward end of the ship is now dedicated to cargo storage. So you can see there's insulated cargo rooms here, insulated tween decks here. You can see there's actually, the designers have marked out, there's quite heavy insulation, probably cork, I would imagine, for, you know, cold storage for foodstuffs and things like that, actually for the voyage. But then the cargo holds themselves, you can see they're covered in these wooden beams, which essentially protect both the exterior of the ship from bulky items if they broke loose, also protected things on the interior of the ship from smashing up against the ship's steel hull, but then also temperature protected things a little bit, because bare steel in the North Atlantic in winter is very cold. You know, the North Atlantic is in some cases like just above or at freezing, basically. So things can get very cold down there, and by simply having a timber, be it pine or whatever, just along the sides there, it can add a little bit of insulation so that anything touching it is not going to be possibly damaged by the cold, or you know, the space itself will be maybe a couple of degrees warmer at the very least. This is really cool. You get a sense of how far down into the ship the mast has to go so that it's supported and won't just break off. So you can see here that it goes 2 full decks below. And here almost looks like it goes into someone's room. It would have been really funny if you paid for your fare, even in third class, and you walk in and there's just a giant pole in the middle. So you have to go around it to see your family. Hi, it's me, editing this video sometime later. And it turns out it did go straight through the middle of the cabin. Although it was a crew cabin, so I guess they don't matter as much, do they, 1910's Cunard line? And then, of course, towards the bow section, we get just a lot of machinery. So this is where you had the docking and mooring equipment, the big anchor windlasses and things like that were required to either drop anchor and hold the ship in place if she was visiting. I think they visited Fishguard, for example. She would regularly visit Fishguard and sort of anchor off there. But then going into, say, Liverpool or New York, you would need to rely on these big things, capstans, for example, to wind in your lines and warp your ship into position against the dock. And so they had big steam engines actually down here. You can actually see one right here. This is a steam engine in profile, and they turned with gears the capstans and sort of made them revolve so that you could wrap a line around it and then let it go, and it would wind the line in. And it was all kept in here. And it was all very loud. And again, that's why this is where you've got your crew. Here's the crew lavatory. These are the crew's toilets. Here's steward's accommodations. Oh, how unfortunate. You're right next to the anchor. You're right next to the capstans. You're right next to the big cargo hatches where they'd be lowering tons of cargo in on sailing day. Even now, actually, they will put entertainers on cruise ships. The accommodation is towards the bow of the ship. And it's not really a problem on, say, like the Queen Mary 2, for example, where you're still going from Southampton to New York. It's 6 days at sea. It's not a big problem. But if you're anchoring in a small harbour and they get in about 5 in the morning, this happened to my friends on board Queen Mary 2 when she was visiting Australia. We anchored off Kangaroo Island, and at 5 o'clock in the morning, they let go of the anchor, and my friends were asleep, and directly above their heads, they heard clunk, 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 clunk. And I think it woke them up. So yeah, just a really beautiful plan. Gee, I wish I could draw like this. By hand, remarkable. So that's Mauretania in profile. Really very cool. There's also a whole set of deck plans, but I just realized I've been recording this video for over half an hour, and we've run out of time. It really is a remarkable testament to the spirit of human engineering, an achievement that people could sit down on just a huge piece of paper, like 5-6 feet long, and with markers and ink, do this and bring this ship to life like this, and then actually build it out of steel and timber. It's just remarkable. So cool. AutoCAD and things like that are amazing, but there's something so beautiful about sitting down with your ruler and your pens and your watercolors and just drawing it yourself. So cool. Whoever the illustrators were, they are to be commended because it is a masterpiece. Well, there you go. Thank you for joining me on the first ever episode of Grand Plans. If there are other ships you'd be interested in us taking a look at, having a look at some of these beautiful plans, we've got really, really nice ones of the Queen Mary, the Lusitania, the Andrea Doria, a whole bunch of them. So yeah, if you're interested in seeing some other ship plans, let me know in the comments what you'd like to see. So thanks so much for joining me on Grand Plans. Until next time, stay safe, stay happy, and I'll see you again. Makes me want to pick up a pen and do some drawing.